Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Olu Ibrahim. I'm the founder and executive director of Kids in Tech. Thank you so much for joining us for our Beyond the Microscope webinar series. We'd love to know where you guys are coming from today, so please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, tell us your name, and where in the world you're joining us from today. I also want to highlight that the live closed captioning is available for this webinar by pressing the live transcript button at the bottom right of your screen. Since our founding in 2016, Kids in Tech has been committed to exciting, educating, and empowering children to acquire the skills and confidence in technology through interactive after-school programs. Our programs focus on helping children develop the necessary tech skills and aptitudes to participate in and be future leaders of the 21st century innovation economy. Due to the confluence of historical crises, greatly exacerbated by COVID-19, it's important now more than ever we explore what does the future of education hold for our nation's children, and how do we help them reach their full potential? Beyond the Microscope is a 4-part webinar series dedicated to topics about education, science, technology, innovation, and business through the voices of folks directly involved in those fields. The goal of this webinar is to spark conversation, discuss how we can all work together to ensure all of our nation's children become successful. In our 4th webinar today, we'll explore the future of work. We'll explore how best we can prepare our kids and youth for the future of work. This part of the program is a 40-minute panel discussion, and we encourage you during the conversation to put your questions in Q&A chat box, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible during the discussion. Before we dive into the program for today, we wanted to thank our event sponsors who made this series possible. Thank you to our first sponsor, SoftWorld. SoftWorld is an award-winning national and solutions firm largely focused in high-tech, engineering, and life science industries. SoftWorld recognizes the inclusion gap within the STEM field and strongly believes in the need to provide opportunities to those historically that don't have them. By empowering these individuals with skills and advancement opportunities, we begin to address both the inequity in the space as well as illuminating national STEM skills shortage. Thank you, SoftWorld. And a special thanks to our media sponsor, the Boston Globe, for this webinar series. The Boston Globe is a 26-time Pulitzer Prize winning news source featuring premium national and news content daily. With the largest news source in the region, the Boston Globe provides more news, analysis, and information about community events, sports, and entertainment than any other local news source. And now a word from Lauren Jones, Executive Vice President at the Massachusetts Business Roundtable.
Hi, everyone. The Massachusetts Business Roundtable is thrilled to partner with Kids in Tech on this series and today's exciting panel. The Roundtable is a nonprofit organization comprised of approximately 90 CEOs, C-suite executives, and senior executives representing major employers from across Massachusetts, and coming together to focus on public policy solutions to strengthen the state's competitiveness and long-term economic vitality. Education and building our future workforce are among our major priorities for the Roundtable, and even more specifically, we believe in investing in STEM and STEAM career pathways and career exploration to spark interest in young people, and this being a key ingredient in building the next generation of talent from communities right here in Massachusetts. We're looking forward to today's discussion and on STEM and the future of work, which will feature representation from our member companies, including Aisha Francis of the Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology and Amy Bunzel from Autodesk. Thank you for the opportunity to be a part of today.
Thank you, Lauren and the Mass Business Roundtable. And now it's time to dive into today's discussion. Just a reminder, this part of the program will be 40 minutes. Please put your questions in the Q&A chat box, and we'll get to as many questions as possible during this conversation. And now I'd like to introduce you to our moderator for today, Katie Johnston. Katie Johnston is a labor reporter who writes about work and income inequality for the Boston Globe. She also edits the global annual Top Places to Work magazine. Katie has been at the Globe since 2002, where she also works as a copy editor, entertainment editor, music editor, and a travel and workplace reporter. Thank you so much, Katie, for moderating this important discussion, and over to you.
Thanks, Olu. I'm so happy to be part of this discussion on such an important topic. We have a panel today that is absolutely bursting with knowledge and insights about how we can prepare tomorrow's workers for jobs that are increasingly intertwined with technology. Amy Bunzel is Executive Vice President of Autodesk's Architecture, Engineering, and Construction Design Solutions, where she manages product strategy and execution for the company's 3D design portfolio. Michael Collins is Vice President at JFF, Jobs for the Future, a national nonprofit working to transform our nation's education and workforce systems to accelerate economic advancement for everyone. Vilas Dar is President of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation in Boston, a philanthropy advancing artificial intelligence and data solutions to create an equitable and sustainable future for all. Aisha Francis is the Chief Executive Officer of Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology, a minority-serving nonprofit technical college in Boston. So welcome, everyone. It seems like it would be helpful to start off by talking about how much artificial intelligence and other similar advanced technologies are part of our daily lives already, and how frequently we interact with them, often without realizing it. Vilas, can you start us off with some examples?
Thanks so much, Katie, and good morning to everyone. I'm delighted to be here with Kids in Tech. So, Katie, you spoke to the fact that AI is pervasive and all around us, and I think of us almost at the moment as the sun is peeking over the horizon. We're starting to see some light that's illuminating the world around us, and we're seeing the early ways that AI is intersecting with our lives. From voice assistants to the beginnings of autonomous cars, from the systems that drive banking and drive online commerce, AI is already everywhere. But it's not quite at the level of the world fully illuminated in the sun high up in the sky. I think we're still waiting for a world in which chatbots become truly conversational, where machine automation inside of factories really becomes something that drives productivity gains in meaningful ways, and where the ways we interact with these technologies change from us as passive consumers to us as co-creators. But I do also want to acknowledge, even as technology is becoming more pervasive, it's also becoming more alien. And what I mean by that is the kinds of technologies that are having such an intimate effect on our lives, they're becoming less explainable. It almost feels like they're in a black box. And as everyday consumers, we know less and less about how decisions are being made. So I just want to say what's at stake here isn't just how we use new products or how people work in an economy driven by AI. There are some pretty fundamental questions about how these technologies are guiding the society we want to create. And as AI becomes more pervasive, those questions are becoming more and more important.
Great. Yeah, that's a very good point. Some predict that before long, every job will have some level of AI enhancement or support, possibly by as soon as the end of the decade. Amy, can you talk about the many ways AI is already infiltrating the workplace and how it could continue to grow and affect how we do our jobs in the future?
Absolutely. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Kids in Tech. Very happy to be here. So one example that I'll highlight is in the architecture, engineering, and construction space, where AI is increasingly helping designers, builders, and manufacturers make better decisions. And a lot of these actually are around sustainability. So the ability to choose better materials and better construction methods really helps deliver better outcomes. And one of the things that's important to remember about AI and automation is that it really starts with the human beings. The humans are constantly creating algorithms to solve problems and improve efficiency. Nobody wants to do repetitive tasks. And so we're seeing a lot of innovation come from people who are looking for ways to drive this kind of automation using AI.
Great. So I think the big question is, what does this all mean for kids today? Michael, how do we prepare them for jobs in this rapidly changing world? And how do we ensure that everyone has access to a high quality education that will prepare them for the wide range of skills that will be needed in the coming years?
Thank you, Katie. Really appreciate that question. I love that you already said high quality education, because that's where I'm going to go in a second. But before I do, I want to thank Kids in Tech. It's a great conversation that they've scheduled here today. So, I think what I'd like to do is just to, as we talk about preparing young people for the future of work, A lot of times we kind of over-index on kind of the STEM disciplines and very specific ways to get them involved, right, in jobs in computer science or, kind of in technology. And I want to kind of just pause us a minute and just really kind of get us to think about, in some ways, it's really counterintuitive. So rather than, kind of thinking about how we prepare young people for the future of work by, kind of a technical answer, I'm going to ask us to embrace kind of a more adaptive approach. Because when you think about this, the skills and competencies that are needed for the future of work, you begin to think about, kind of being able to think critically, being able to solve problems, being able to collaborate with different folks, and being able to learn, right? All of those things are going to be really critical to be successful in the future of work. Now, strong grounding in kind of digital and technology skills are critically important, but these other kind of broader skills are equally important. And I think it's really important to remember that. As we think about preparing people for the future of work, and young people in particular, it's really important that we think about kind of that young person's range, right, of their work life, right? So if you look at the data, kind of STEM preparation, in some cases, young people transition from kind of post-secondary into jobs more quickly. But if you look down the road after 10 years or so, people who studied in other areas, liberal arts and some of the humanities, tend to catch up, right? So I want to make sure that we don't narrow the conversation very specifically to tech, to computer science, to digital when we're talking about the future of work, because these other skills will be, kind of equally important. And, we can continue that a little bit later, but I just thought I'd broaden the aperture of kind of the conversation a bit. We've talked a lot about AI and tech, and that's important, but these broader skills are important too. So Katie, back to you.
I wonder if you could elaborate on that point, Michael. You said like liberal arts folks, people who studied other things tend to catch up after about 10 years. So I'm curious what you mean by that.
Yeah, so as you might imagine, so the STEM fields, kind of are in some cases really aligned, more closely aligned to what employers need, kind of when you think about people coming directly out of college, right? So when you look at labor market returns, it is true that people that are educated in the STEM disciplines actually are employed more quickly, and they get a premium in wages in comparison to people who study liberal arts and humanities. But if you look at the data, labor market returns 10 years out, STEM disciplines are very, they change a lot. They can be difficult. And 10 years out, over half of the people that studied in STEM actually leave the field, right? And we find that people in liberal arts and humanities, when you look at their salaries, many of them catch up. Again, we're talking 10 years. And the data kind of shows us that in some cases, the people with the liberal arts skills and, say, humanities and other disciplines, there is some evidence that they also can have kind of technology skills, they can have digital skills, they can have business process skills, kind of project management and things that are important to employers. So I guess the important point I want to take away from here is that, to be prepared for the future of work, people need to be prepared in a range, of disciplines. And it's really important for us to think about kind of STEM as an important part, right? It's an important part of preparation, but we don't want to look at STEM as kind of mutually exclusive, right, to other industries.
That makes sense. Okay, good. So I'm not totally lost as a wordsmith liberal arts major.
You're not.
All right, good. Well, so this growing emphasis on sophisticated technology has the potential to create an even bigger educational divide between kids in well-funded school systems and those whose computer labs are barely functioning, between students attending two-year colleges and those going to Ivy League or other highly selective schools. Aisha, how do we combat this? How do we keep inequities from growing due to this increasing reliance on technology?
Well, thank you for that question. It's certainly a big question, and I hope it's one that we'll, collectively try to answer as we go along here. I'm so happy to have the opportunity to speak with these leaders. I think the first thing I want to share is, from my perspective, one of the challenges we have is setting up so many hierarchies, right? Even in the way that we framed that question is the either or. And Michael, you spoke to this a bit, right? Which is, well, quite eloquently, that it's not so much all or nothing. And I think that the assumption that, for instance, that we need to sort of pit the two-year colleges perhaps against more selective institutions is a difficult one. And it what we should be thinking of for the good of students is how we can collaborate. So, at Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology, we have collaborations with MIT. We have collaborations with other institutions that are more well endowed. And I think that in the space of working together is where we can break down the real inequity that exists and help to create pathways for students that work best for the individualized, for their individualized interests. We have particular specialty areas. More than 40% of students of color who go to college directly from high school land at two-year institutions. So there's a tremendous value to thinking about from a strength-based and asset-based frame, what two-year colleges offer. And then seeing where there are places that we can build stronger relationships and stronger connections to four-year colleges if that's where students want to go next. So, I think that's one of the ways to think about how to prevent the exacerbation of inequality is to build partnerships and bridges between more well-endowed institutions and those that are really working on more meager annual budgets.
That makes sense. Can you say a little bit more about the MIT partnership that Benjamin Franklin has?
Sure, it's actually a partnership, and that is through our reentry services area. We, for a decade, have offered education to returning citizens and also behind the wall. And for about 3 years, we've done some of that work in partnership with MIT. So, that's a way in which, we have a very strong area of expertise there. And MIT actually is looking to us for best practices in some ways. So I think there's lots of ways that we can help each other mutually.
That's great. That's excellent. So rapidly advancing technology will no doubt disrupt many aspects of academics. How could AI and machine learning be applied to STEM disciplines such as biotech and life sciences, as well as to other fields of study? Amy, do you have thoughts on that?
I do. Something that is really interesting is that AI can really be used by anyone that needs to interact with lots of data and use data to inform future decisions. So this really means that any study, and I appreciate what Michael said, it's not just about the STEM fields. This technology is becoming more and more pervasive everywhere, can really use data to solve problems and make better decisions. So researchers and educators are over time really going to think about AI as just another tool in their toolbox for how they accomplish their work. So it will play a role in thinking about how we look at patterns and principles and how we apply these new technologies to solve problems. And one of the other things that we haven't really touched on here, but I think it came up a little bit from Vilas, is there's a lot of ethics that are ethical decisions that will be involved in how we use all this data and how we leverage AI. So that's another field that will be involved in this whole AI conversation as we go forward.
Right. Yeah, that's a whole other panel.
Yep.
Probably, right. Well, let's talk about the different types of training that can give people access to technology-focused jobs and how that might look going forward. I imagine, computer science degrees already have many new requirements than they did even 10 years ago. And there are so many other ways to break into the field besides getting a traditional college degree. There's boot camps and certification programs that don't require nearly as much time or money. What options are out there, and what more needs to be done to increase them, you think? Aisha or Michael, could one of you start this off?
Sure. In computer science, I'm really thinking about the earlier access to those skills, whether that's through AP or through early college courses that a student could take on a campus, a high school student could take on a campus that introduces them earlier on to these principles in a way that doesn't lock them into a major. So I think that's one of the things that we can do, at least in Boston Public Schools. I know there is very uneven uptake and availability of, I should say availability, not uptake of AP computer science. And even when it is available, not many students take the test. We are working, again, I'm gonna harp on partnerships here with another organization to offer college credit to students who are taking computer science through an alternative means. Just again, these are high school students, so what we want to do as much as possible is get them exposure earlier on to those kinds of principles. And even if they choose not to focus on that area, they at least have the confidence that they are competent in something, and it really demystifies those principles for them, even if they become, a humanist like me, as an English major, knowing that I'm not intimidated by what computer science is and what it offers can help them along the way.
Yeah, I love Aisha's answer. I mean, it's I didn't think you were going to go there, and and it makes so much sense, right? Like, how are we exposing young people earlier? Love the dual enrollment early college, and I would add that because digital has implications across all programs of study, digital and tech have implications for all programs of study, right? Our lives are going to be more kind of influenced. We're going to be experiencing AI and technology and all things digital, not just in, not just with our computers, right? For me to get into my building, I'll use my phone to unlock, kind of the door, like there's, implications across all fields of study. So one of the things that I think is really important for us to be thinking about, Aisha gave the example of kind of, say, an English major or a humanist. We need to train young people to see opportunities for digitization, right? Like it's a critical thinking, it's a problem solving, it's an invention, it's an ideation, right? Some people who have novel ideas did not necessarily start out in tech, right? They digitized, kind of a novel idea, right? So I think that we want to democratize, right? Like, not continue the conversation to have tech as being something very specific, right? And let's kind of widen the opportunities. The other thing I would mention is that I think it's really critical that we have robust kind of career navigation supports, right? So young people face so many different kind of options in technology. So it's not just kind of a computer science degree, right? There are certifications, CompTIA, there are apprenticeships, there are other kind of learn and earn models. There are employer models. Google has, they have their IT certificate. Amazon, has, kind of ways that they, kind of train their employees, all kinds of different certificates. So the plethora of options, right, to enter kind of the digital and tech fields, I can only imagine will grow. And as Aisha was saying, some of these opportunities actually start in high school, like if you're dually enrolled on a track, right? So the sooner that we can help young people with kind of navigational supports to understand where these credentials can take them with regard to entering the labor market, but also with regard to advancing, right? Not just, we don't want people just to get a job and kind of stay there, but what are the implications for advancement? What types of credentials do they need to advance? So those are some of the kind of other, I think, variables that we need to think about as we're thinking about this question.
Amy, did you want to add something?
I did, Michael. You brought up a lot of topics that spurred ideas for me. One, I think it's important that people know that Autodesk offers all of our software for free to students and institutions, and that's starts in elementary school, where we have some really accessible, fun tools that get kids interested in design. And we also offer credentials that are very much focused on industries and allow people to demonstrate that they have, a skill sets that'll be valuable to some of those very specific jobs. And then there's one other aspect of it that is also exciting to me, is that there's a lot of jobs that are digitizing today. There's careers and fields that are really seeing a lot of intense change. One of them is construction and the other is manufacturing. And these are jobs that typically weren't as maybe highly prized as some of the other jobs at the beginning of the design or manufacturing process, but these are really important transformative positions that are becoming available across these industries that offer a lot of opportunity for people who can help lead some of the digitization there.
That's great. That's a really good point to bring up manufacturing and construction. I think people often don't think of that as being a high-tech job, but it makes so much sense.
Can I just
Yeah.
make one clarification? Someone in the chat asked, what is AP? It's advanced placement. So the whole series of testing that and teaching that culminates in a test that students are eligible to take that is accepted at college credit at most institutions.
Great. Yeah. Thanks for seeing that and clarifying that. Vilas, do you see technology opening up opportunities for new types of jobs and roles that are more open to a broader range of people, not just those who are good at math and can afford a four-year degree? And if so, how does that work?
Yeah, I absolutely do, Katie, and thanks for the question. I might answer it by building a little bit on what Michael and Aisha and Amy have spoken about, and let me make a provocative statement. What we don't need in the world today, and what I think would be a great tragedy, is if we ask the kids of today all to become technologists for the sake of having a technology job. And let me say that a different way. If we take those kids who are ready to be world-changing teachers and entrepreneurs and artists, people who bring the very best of human work to the table, and say, instead, you should go and get a STEM discipline degree, we are doing a disservice to an entire generation and to a society. If we start from there and then come back and re-examine some of the principles here, the first thing here is I think this distinction that we have made somewhat artificially between education and training, that you go and you get a degree that somehow teaches you about life, and then you go and you get some sort of workforce preparation that prepares you for a job. I think that construct we have to address and begin to break down and say, look, for those young people who are deeply passionate about a human-oriented discipline, technology is going to be a pervasive part of their work. For a teacher to understand how to use these tools in the classroom, for an artist to understand how these increase their ability to express their imagination and creativity. So we have to stop thinking about disciplines as the primary orientation and instead say, what are the new opportunities for work in a technology-enabled world? I've spent a little bit of time thinking in particular about rural and vulnerable populations that are subject to automation. What I mean by this are generally populations that have those kinds of repetitive roles in factories and manufacturing that Amy's talked about. And it is absolutely the case, and we have to acknowledge that those might be the jobs that are first displaced because we have those automation and robots coming into factories. The answer isn't to say to those individuals that are displaced, we're sorry that happened, now go and understand something about technology so you can get a job in the new economy. That's a fundamentally inequitable and unjust proposition. Instead, we have to start from a different place and say, okay, well, technology has enabled some greater productivity in these communities. The holders of capital, the owners of these factories are benefiting from it. What's their obligation to support new work in these communities? How do we make sure that these people have functional ways to express all of those other things that are necessary? And you asked a little bit about what are the new kinds of jobs that'll emerge. I don't know that there are entirely new types or categories, but I do think we're going to see an increasing prominence on jobs that prioritize human service, the ability to engage with people around things like social work, around helping them find their pathways to economic opportunity, to identity, to agency. I think we'll see jobs that come with understanding how technology gets integrated into the work that we're doing, right? So rather than needing to be a roboticist, maybe understanding how robots introduced into a workflow or onto a factory line is changing and letting us create new opportunities for people to engage with things like quality control or pieces that aren't purely repetitive but require human imagination. And then I think the third part of this is we need literacy around AI and tech that, as I said, isn't just a part of a workforce skills training program, but equips all of us with a language to talk about technology as it intersects with civic values. Amy, you mentioned ethics earlier, and I know that's a conversation that's really quite hot at the moment. We need to expand that conversation out to say, what does democracy look like? And what are the kinds of jobs that people are going to have in a robust and equitable society where AI, even if it's really centered into areas of economic productivity, are creating gains that we should all share in. And I think, Aisha, the work that you do at the Benjamin Franklin Institute is so important for that, right? Because in order for us all to participate, we have to create new pathways of access. And some of that means starting from community and figuring out how you get to a credential. Some of it means starting from community and figuring out how you get to identity and agency.
Well, Vilas, I wonder, to follow up on that, do you think that AI and tech will kind of flow naturally into some of this training for non-STEM jobs? You know, you mentioned the human service jobs and other jobs like that. I mean, we're going to have to make some sort of effort, right, to connect these things, but to a certain degree, it's just happening, right?
Yeah, let me say, I think there is an inevitability to it that it will happen, but unfortunately, I'm not so positive that it'll happen naturally or smoothly. In fact, I think we're going to see a lot of disruption. And I think one of the requirements that creates is an intentionality on the part of folks like the ones on this panel in the audience, but really across society, to say, there are going to be short-term injustices and inequities created because of the speed by which these disruptions are happening. And our role is to step in and figure out, how do we smooth them? How do we keep an eye on what populations are being disproportionately affected? How are our teachers being equipped to understand how to bring these disciplines into the classroom? How are our employers understanding how to define the needs of their workforce 5 or 10 years out? And take responsibility now to say, we're going to help educational institutions and certifiers build for that. So my short answer to your question is, I think it's going to be quite a wild ride, but we have a responsibility to step in and make it smoother.
Right, exactly. I mean, and we talk about that these things will exist in all different types of jobs, and you don't necessarily have to go through the STEM field, but math clearly is playing a huge part in a lot of these very tech focused jobs, right? But there's also a huge math bias, especially among and toward girls who think they're not good at math. And I wonder, Aisha or Amy, I know you have thoughts on this too. How do we combat that to make sure that women have a seat at the table?
Sure, I think there are many ways to do that. From my perspective, I think one of the most important is acknowledging that representation matters, and to find ways to make it very apparent to the young women and girls in our spheres of influence that math is for them. I think young girls come to think that math isn't something for them because of codes, the unwritten curriculum and hidden bias that is around them. So I think we have to be very careful about what we're exposing girls to. At our college, the department chairs of and program directors of many of our technical areas, electrical engineering, construction management, practical electricity, are women. I think that is really important. That is a step in the right direction. And we have ways that we need to go to be even more welcoming to women on campus. So I think there is a multifaceted approach, but really being aware of the inputs that women and girls, young women and girls receive, making sure that we are conscious about representation in technical fields and careers where we can, are two that I think of and that come to mind, two ways to really combat that disconnect.
That makes sense. Amy, did you want to add anything, or?
Absolutely. I also think the sort of sponsoring women and making sure that they have good role models so that they can see themselves as they're, as they're sort of looking around to see, where to take inspiration is an aspect of it. And we sponsor several different programs. Some are cohort based, where it's all, young women and girls in the programs kind of, learning from each other, but others are also broader, really trying to inspire, younger kids to think about math in a more, I think about it more in a creative and a design aspect, and things that might be less less academic, but more fun, that kind of inspire them to consider these things as they get older and maybe have other distractions in their lives, but to really be inspired by what can be accomplished on the design side of things.
That's great. As somebody
Katie, can I say,
Yeah.
I think there's so speaking of technology and disruption, I think there's a huge opportunity, right, for learning science and AI. Like, we need strategies, right, to help people who are not as prepared as they might be in math. I mean, so over half of all students that come into community college test into one or more developmental math courses, right? So and many of those are young women, many of those are young people of color. So could we leverage AI and technology on a next generation strategy, right, to give those young people the supports they need in the context of the fields in which they want to study, right? So I'm naming that as potential innovation that I think could be game changing, because if you come in and your math preparation isn't at a certain level, you really, a number of programs of study could come off the table, right? Like, and some of those programs of study are aligned with, good jobs, right? So I think that is something we want to absolutely disrupt, for young women, and also for people coming out of, under-resourced high schools that don't actually have the, kind of strong mathematics kind of opportunities.
Michael, I'll highlight something that's happening in Boston this summer. The Boston Public School System is structuring a summer learning program for middle school students. It's going to be using a product from Autodesk, called Tinkercad. And it's really trying to help fill some of the math learning loss that happened during COVID with all the distance learning. So creating both an engaging program, but also one that will help people kind of gain some of what they lost. And they're trying to also do it in a way that it feels culturally relevant to the Boston community. So I think that's going to be hopefully a fun and exciting way to kind of fill some of those.
That's awesome, gaps. Amy. That's terrific. Wow, that's great.
Somebody had asked in the chat about examples of how work will look like in industries besides manufacturing. And we were gonna talk about all the jobs associated with video games. So that might be one way in. I don't know if that's what they're interested in, but I mean, so obviously video games, involves far more than just coders, right? I mean, Amy, can you talk a little bit about how different types of roles are associated with developing a video game, and what kind of training you might need for those roles?
Absolutely. So it's an interesting thing I talk a lot about when I do career fairs, is software companies like Autodesk or any company producing video games or all kinds of technology things. Actually, you need a wide variety of skills. So, the roles range from, if you're doing a video game, you need someone to design the characters, you need someone to think about the movements, somebody to build the virtual world, somebody to create the textures and the fire and all the special effects, as well as someone to write the storyline, right? And someone who might be developing a line of, physical products that relate to the game. So the possibilities are really endless. And the other interesting thing is there's also the rest of the roles that create a company. You need marketing, right? You need web design, you need e-commerce, you need human resources and sales and finance and legal teams. So I think if someone has a passion around something related to STEM, it doesn't mean they have to be the people doing the software development and the coding. There's many ways to be involved in that ecosystem. On the more STEM side, there's definitely computer science and programming, there's user experience, product management, electrical and mechanical engineers, data science. There's quite a long list, but there's also the sort of non-tech jobs that are really important in fulfilling a company's mission.
Do any of you else have thoughts on jobs and kind of maybe non-traditional, not just being a computer coder, but other things that are opening up?
Yeah, I might jump in, and just to build off that idea of how video games work, I recently got to play, for those who remember text-based video games, something where you'd log on and you kind of walk through an environment and there'd be a preset kind of description of the room you'd walk into. Well, now using GPT-3, which is a AI-based tool that allows you to kind of create human speech, you now have a video game that's possible that you can go online and play, where you can play and tell the game what it is that you want to do. And the game will generate on the fly an entire new realistic world based on the keywords and what you said. So what's happened here is, instead of having a video game designer who pre-built your journey that you had to explore as the player of the video game, now the world's being created based on what you want to do and what you want to accomplish. And the designer's role has shifted from figuring out every detail of the journey they want you to have, to now almost being a counterpart, to somebody who can say to the system, oh, this person wants to fight a dragon. Well, let me tell you what a dragon is so that when that happens, you can generate an entire body of text about it. We could envision this happening in a 3D world, where instead of a designer coming in and saying, let me render all the art, let me make sure that world meets a particular model, I, as the player, might be able to design the world on the fly. And the designer's job has shifted to one of imagination and creativity, of equipping the system to be able to respond to me. It's a lot more psychology and behavioral insight than it is knowing how to draw a particular dragon. Those kinds of jobs are everywhere. I recently spoke to a set of medical doctors who shared with me that their work was transforming, not because they needed less medical knowledge, but rather that the repetitive and small bits of what they might have to do, going to reference a medical library or a medical textbook, is instead being equipped by a technology solution that helps them become a better doctor. Because when they see a patient, the system says, might be one of 5 things, here's what to look for. And a doctor can spend their time in the clinical room really engaging with the patient. I think you're going to see this transformation inside of jobs as much as you're going to see new jobs being created.
Great. Well, so in order to prepare kids for these types of jobs, we need a lot, right? We need policies, funding, infrastructure put in place that will help everyone get access to these roles, and not just those with well-off parents or top grades. What should different sectors be doing to address the challenges of preparing kids for careers that might not even exist yet? Education, nonprofits, private employers. Michael, what do you think?
I'm happy to start us off. So I think, going back to kind of how we kind of broadened the conversation to, ensure that we are talking about kind of both STEM and non-STEM. And I love how Vilas kind of opened it broader, that we are actually not solving a tech problem, we are solving this is a social, problem. And so when I think about kind of preparing young people kind of for the future of work, and we think about policies. So first, if I think about secondary, I think just foundationally, right, we need to make sure that there are aligned kind of college and career ready standards, that those are real, and that, young people in this country are able to have a high quality education regardless of, the region where they live in, regardless of zip code. So there's some fundamental things like that. And, kind of per Aisha's comments, increased support for broader access to dual enrollment, early college, kind of AP and IB, particularly for low-income students of color, who are in high schools that in some cases do not have those options. We're not giving them the foundation, right, to be able to fully prepare themselves for a future in which learning will be constant, right? So if they don't have that strong foundation, right, we are kind of not supporting them for the future. Also, at the secondary level, I think that increased support for counseling, advising, and career navigation. As I mentioned earlier, there are many credentials. In fact, it's if you combine post-secondary credentials and non-academic credentials, it's approaching like a million unique credentials in the United States, right? Like 500,000 of those are non-academic, like your badges and licenses and things like that. And and the others are, kind of the traditional. So young people need help kind of aligning. And so if you think about kind of the entry into the labor market and also kind of earnings, right? Young people have no way of knowing. So policy supports around kind of supporting them to have access to high quality counseling, advising, and career navigation. On the post-secondary side, I really think that we need kind of policy strategies that grow and diversify kind of alternative routes to, kind of good jobs. So I think about apprenticeships. How do we grow and diversify apprenticeships and learn to earn, kind of models, so college is not the only way. How do we incentivize that? I also think that, for low-income students of color, Black students in particular, many of them have less access to employment networks and people who are working in industries in which they might be interested. So they have less kind of what's called kind of professional social capital, right? So like, how do we, through policy, create incentives for more work-based learning, for more internships. Many of those, if they could be paid internships, I think could really help. Incentives for integrating kind of career services into kind of academic programming, right? All too often, we approach education from the supply side, like what the high school and what the colleges are producing, completely separate from what kind of employers need. Like, how do we bring some of that together so young people early on are getting exposure to work? They're getting exposure to a range of jobs that they might be interested in. We need policy supports to make that kind of integration happen. The systems work very separately now, so some supports there. And just, I think the other thing I would say in terms of kind of policy supports, we really need incentives. And actually this kind of builds on what I just said. We need incentives for post-secondary and industry collaborations more broadly. So I love the work that is happening with some employers. Actually, they're creating credentials, right, that have kind of provide a wage premium in their business, but also kind of in others. And sometimes they're badging kind of those skills. Sometimes they're collaborating with higher education institutions, right, so that people are getting credit for things that they might have learned in a business, right? Like they can get college credit for that they can apply to something else. So policy incentives for those kinds of collaborations, I think, would be terrific.
That makes sense. Vilas, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I want to provide a robust yes and, Michael. I agree with everything you said, but I also think there's space to shift the focus from how we fix systems and institutions to really empowering young people to take ownership about this problem that we face, right? I'm getting to the point in my life where I used to be the tech whiz kid that knew everything about every tech product out there. And now I'm learning how to use TikTok from my 10-year-old niece and nephew. Don't look for it. There are no videos of me dancing on the internet. But look, I mean, here's the thing that's changing, right? Is like, we need to now begin going from how do we provide credentials that prepare a generation for work in an existing system to asking how are we going to reimagine the system based on the interests of the young people that are out there. I know there are some pretty incredible movements already doing that, bringing youth into policy councils, putting them on advisory boards to tech companies and to even credential making institutions. More fundamentally, I also think that as we think about credentials or pathways to access, we need to look at the totality of life experience for youth today. I think about a program called the Hidden Genius Project that's based out in Oakland and has as its core mission, how do we make sure that young Black men have access to technology careers? And as much as that program's about providing technology skills or creating a space for experimenting with tech, it's also about understanding the socioeconomic factors which surround these young men that put them onto alternative pathways that are maybe not so wholesome. And understanding that trying to get them into technology skills requires a fully holistic approach to the human that says, let's also build social leadership skills. Let's make sure that you understand how the choices you're making on a daily basis are impacting the families around you. So many other pieces of that. So if we really want to think about what the sectoral approach to transformation looks like, I think we have to bring to bear nonprofits and social institutions. We have to bring together employers and academic institutions. And we need to bring kind of the voice of youth perspectives right into the core of that and say, we understand this is the kind of sticky multi-generational problem that requires a really concerted approach together. With all that in mind, oh, please go ahead.
I'm sorry, Vilas.
No, please.
I was just going to say, I agree. And I think there also needs to be a way to help simplify the landscape, right? So how does an empowered young person navigate 1 million credentials and badges, and how do they decide with help from a guidance counselor, or if advanced placement, international, baccalaureate, or early college is best for them? There are a plethora of choices, and I think need to acknowledge that it is complicated, and in some ways perhaps more complicated than it should be. But I think having navigational tools in place for both institutions that need to decide which of these arrays, of interventions they're going to engage in, because we can't do it all, for employers that need to decide which of these interventions they're going to engage in. Those are choices that have to be made, and it's one that decide that where we need some help thinking about best practices at the policy level. I think that's where there can be some investment made and research done to say, here's what works for particular populations, and then there could be better matching that happens, because it's not to say that we need to have less options. We need better ways to think about what the end goal is, what population you're trying to affect, what the needs are of your company, and then to say, okay, now that I know what the needs are, here are some of the directions that we can go in. And then the other thing I just wanted to mention is one intervention that we haven't talked about, as a way to diversify technology pipelines. And I think I would love to have more employers invest in becoming fair chance hirers, because that's a pathway there. I think of Dave's Killer Bread, that has done such good work in that area.
Can you define that, Aisha? Fair chance employer?
Oh, okay. Fair chance employer are ones that take away hurdles for people who have past court involvement to become employed, because that is, a huge driver of recidivism. It is that people cannot get jobs. People can't get, even with ban the box legislation, it's not enforced. People still bring their own biases. Institutions bring their own biases to the hiring process. And so fair chance employers put in place practices to take away and strip away those barriers for people that have a record, so that they can get gainful employment. And I think that is a huge, there's a need for more employers to sign on to that practice.
Yes, definitely. Well, I wanted to get to a couple of questions in the Q&A. And someone mentioned that he works with students, and he once told them that they're engineers at Google starting off making $190,000 a year, which is amazing. He said they were floored. Me too. And he wanted to know, how do you get kids of color seeing people who look like them in successful STEM or technology related fields, to kind of show them the opportunities that are out there? Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
I would just acknowledge that is an important need, as someone who just said representation matters. So, and I acknowledge the fact that when you are a person of color or a woman in these fields, there are a lot of requests coming your way. And so we call that like an extra tax, right? Like you have your own things to your own pathway to navigate, and a responsibility to reach back, right? So I suggest leveraging organizations such as NSBE, the National Society of Black Engineers, all of these powerful groups that exist, and for every sector and field, there are plenty of these kinds of groups. So leverage those groups. And then I would also say leverage the internet. There's all sorts of powerful testimonials that are available to demonstrate to folks, even if they aren't able to meet them personally, here are multiple people who have made their pathway, and here's their story, and they're telling their story directly. So those are two suggestions I offer.
That's great.
I would offer also, there's an organization called Reboot Representation, and it's about getting more Black, Latinx, and Indigenous women in tech. And so lots of great data and examples about how to get in tech. And I'll mention that, like, while we can name tech and we can name, kind of examples of high salaries, regrettably, like when you read about kind of access, to some of these opportunities, there's a long way to go, right, to create kind of equity, not just in access, but in advancement. Like when you see some people that are entering some of the tech kind of jobs, they'll stay kind of at entry level, they don't advance. And then also, there's data that there's a lot of work that has to be done about the culture of kind of tech, right? And in some cases, it's been documented that it's, inhospitable to, women and people of color. So while we, turn young people on to these opportunities, at the same time, let's be working to ensure that, the industries in which, we are suggesting, that they go to, right, that we are working to dismantle some of the, or, kind of take down some of the kind of the practices that are frankly kind of biased. So I just want to name that, like, it's not a panacea. These are great opportunities, but there's also great work that needs to be done.
Yeah, I feel like I'm constantly getting studies of wage gaps, new entries into, I think I just got one in tech, and it was, women make, X% less and people of color make X% less in the same jobs, and so there's definitely a huge barrier there to overcome.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit about, companies have I think a strong obligation to really look at their recruiting practices, yes, and think differently and be more open to maybe non-traditional entrants. But also once we hire these people, we have to make sure we're creating a welcoming and, fair and inclusive environment. And there's a lot that can be done with, technology to, there's all the whole new field of people analytics. And you can look at you can compare, through surveys, the experience that your, more sort of traditional employees might be having against your underrepresented employees. And if you see gaps there and you see higher attrition from one group over another, you really need to get in there and figure out, what's going on and why is this happening in your company.
There's another question from somebody out there who is interested in a late life change into tech, and wondered if you guys had thoughts on courses you'd recommend to build a foundation to make a switch.
So I'm happy to start. This is not my area of expertise, but what so there's a platform called SkillUp. It's a collaboration of JFF and some other organizations that people can go to, it helps kind of assess skills and kind of offers a set of trainings. And so it might be kind of help them with kind of a direction. There's also a similar platform. Guild has a similar platform. And so I think that, those kinds of kind of skilling assessments could give them directional information. Having said that, there are others on this panel that probably have much more detailed kind of information.
Michael, I think those are two that are excellent. I also suggest Job Ready, which is another platform for a similar type of, it's an aggregator essentially of a lot of some free and some very moderately priced reskilling platforms. So I put that link in the website, and look at I don't know where this person is from, but I would encourage them to look at their local to your colleges as well. If they are interested in in-person training as opposed to online training, or a blend, there are likely divisions of continuing and professional studies and their local institutions that would be happy to speak with them and counsel them and do some placement conversations. I know we do that kind of work at Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology. So I think that, that's certainly a place to go as well.
Kind of on the flip side of that, and another question from the audience was, what are your thoughts on apprenticeships, not for career switchers or later in life people, but for recent high school grads? Is that something that's happening more? Is that necessary? How does that fit into the boot camps and certification programs and that sort of thing?
I can jump in here. So I think it's really critically important. So JFF has a center for apprenticeships. So I would send folks there. So apprenticeships are really a critical strategy, right? They are essentially a learn and earn strategy. A young person is learning kind of a trade in an industry, and they're being supported to learn, and they are typically kind of also off being paid essentially. So I think that there's a lot of energy around apprenticeships as we as a nation grapple with kind of the cost of higher education, looking at kind of student debt, looking at labor market returns, right? Not all credentials pay off equally. And I think that there is kind of a growing sentiment in the country that a 4-year credential, right, that actually takes 6 years should not be the arbiter, right, like of access to a good job, right? Like that's just not right. So strategies like apprenticeship are getting lots and lots of attention and could be very, very strong options for young people. The challenge, right, always the challenge, is that when we look at some of the apprenticeships, we see some of the disproportionate outcomes, right? So like they're not typically diverse, right? Both racially, gender, and as well as gender. And so there's work to be done, right? To begin to diversify apprenticeships and ensure that there's equity and opportunity for apprenticeships. But they're really critical. I think that we'll see more and more. And frankly, that people know apprenticeships from manufacturing and things like that. But there are IT apprenticeships, healthcare, construction. There are additional industries that are thinking about like, hey, we want to create, partner to create an apprenticeship for people to come into kind of our industry. And so some of that is happening in like business and finance. And so I'm expecting that we will see more of this strategy grow. I think it's very promising.
Great. I don't know if this is something you guys will all know much about, but we'll give it a shot. Someone wants to know about your thoughts on how bots will change surgery and medicine.
I can respond a little bit there. We have customers who build a lot of equipment for that space. I think if we actually broaden it to think about learning, I think bots and personalized learning and using data and analytics to understand like where a person is on a learning journey and what they need to learn next can apply to pretty much any profession. And as long as you've got kind of the right people building the program. So I think that will help people in the medical field in particular. But the other area I'll throw in here, since we're talking about technology, is augmented and virtual reality will also play a big role in training for all kinds of jobs, medical being one of them, because you can get sort of the simulated hands-on experience before you go and do the real thing. And that applies to many of the fields we've been talking about if there's a like a physical aspect to the job. So there's lots of ways for learners to engage going forward. And I would say, bots are one, AI is one. There's quite a bit of technology coming to that space too.
One of the things I find interesting about that, my first job in Boston was at a free care hospital, and the hospital, this was 2005, had this huge splash about investing in a cyber knife, the equipment, and that was now 16 years ago. So I think I'm fascinated sometimes by the ways in which this has been building for quite a while. And there's increasing, I think, layperson knowledge about it. But one of the things that I tell people all the time, this isn't new. Automation, bots is not new. It's probably, maybe it's more apparent because you can't, open any kind of website these days without a chat bot saying, how can I help you? And so I think there's that sense in which, things are becoming more transparent, but the underlying technology and the underlying, I think, overlap between, human skill and the enhancement of that skill, through machining has been with us for a long time.
Very true.
There's another question from an audience member who wanted to deepen the conversation about the Fair Chance program in talking about STEM organizations and who needs to be brought into this circle to advance the concept. Anyone want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think the very, if possible, the very top of the organization, right, the top of the food chain, but it could also be conversations in the workplace that are coming up through employee resource groups, through other networks that have quite a bit of agency. I think there is, from the outside, yesterday was the 1-year anniversary of the murder of George Floyd. I think there's lots of conversation among activist communities about the fact that and has been for a while, we cannot afford as a nation that has invested so much in incarceration to leave an entire subset of human capital behind. It is wasteful for our GDP. It is wasteful, to the individuals and their families. And, so I think that in terms of who needs to be involved in the conversation within a company, I think, thinking about decision makers and who you are able to influence among the employee base to request that kind of engagement is an important place to start.
Great, okay. It looks like maybe we have time for one more. This person wants to know, any thoughts on how business credentialing can create new jobs?
Well, I mean, I think I talked a little bit about that, so that by business credentialing, I'm assuming that they mean, like, so for example, kind of Amazon or McDonald's or Autodesk, right? Like, if they essentially put, kind of their employees through, say, a training program, and they give them credit, right, for what they've learned, not only can that create value for that individual kind of maybe advancing within that company, I think that we're looking at a future where people can take those, kind of skill signifiers, or those, those badges or certificates to other employers, right? To be able to get jobs, and, progressively better jobs. So I think that what we are seeing is, as we begin to think about alternatives to traditional kind of bachelor's degrees, we're seeing kind of innovations like kind of these employers creating kind of their own credentials. And I think that this is a trend that I think we want to think about kind of as part, right, of a credentialing strategy. I don't think that we should think about it separate. I'd like to, see people be able to have portability, right? Like, we don't want those credentials just to only be used. I'd be curious, Amy, if you have any thoughts about that. You are actively doing this at Autodesk.
We are, and I think it's sort of a new way of demonstrating competence that ought to transfer, across a company, as you might be moving between organizations, but also then outside the company. And we are building a whole series of what we're calling sort of smaller micro credentials in some cases, that are things you can earn in the process of doing your job, so that it's not this, oh gosh, how do I find, hours or weeks to attend a training program, but how do I really learn and evolve as I'm doing the work that I'm being, requested to do for my employer, but I can also then better myself and have a transferable credential when I'm done.
And I just want to jump in to add one more perspective on this, which is, we have to remember that credentials are two-sided value, right? To a potential employee, and understanding of how to do something, for an employer really focused on what that employer needs. We have to be very careful that we don't build a system where every employer comes up with their own credential that trains somebody on their system, and then that person doesn't have a transferable skill set. So it is going to be a little bit of, how do we make sure we're teaching critical thinking and an understanding of how systems fit together, not just using a particular tool to get a credential to get a job.
That makes sense. Well, I think we're at the end of our time here, unless there's anything that you guys want to add.
Thank you, Katie.
Yeah.
And thank you, Kids in Tech.
you.
It's great.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thanks, guys. I learned a lot.
Me too, Katie. I learned a lot. Thank you, Katie, so much for taking the time to moderate this important discussion. Thank you to Aisha, Vilas, Amy, and Michael. Thank you for sharing your time and expertise with us today. Like I said, I learned a lot, and I hope our audience at home, you guys learned a lot too. So that being said, thank you again to SoftWorld for being our visionary sponsor for our inaugural webinar series, and to the Boston Globe for being our media partner for the entire series as well. I also want to thank Eastern Bank, iRobot, and the Massachusetts Business Roundtable as well for their support for our inaugural webinar series. And I'd like to thank all of you from home who showed up to all of our webinars and engaged in these important conversations. I hope that you take time to continue to have these conversations with those close to you in your life. And I hope that this motivates you to figure out how can we all move our nation forward and really ensure that all our kids are successful. Thank you to everyone. We appreciate you being here, and we'll see you next time. Bye now.